Let me ask you an uncomfortable question. Have you ever thought that a muscle car could be too expensive? Not today, not at auctions, not after becoming a legend. I'm talking about when they were new, when they were sitting on dealership floors, when people saw them and decided not to buy them. In the 1960s, the muscle car was born from a simple idea: accessible power, brutal performance, and reasonable prices. But some manufacturers crossed a dangerous line. They raised prices. They bet on extreme engines, absurd homologation requirements, and decisions the public simply didn't understand. The result was a fascinating paradox: incredible cars, radical designs, technology far ahead of its time, and yet, they were so expensive that nobody wanted them. In this video, we're taking a look at 1960s muscle cars that were already expensive in their own era. 1969 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. When Pontiac introduced the Trans Am in 1969, the proposal was ambitious. They didn't want just another loud, exaggerated muscle car. They wanted something more serious, more focused on handling, sporting image, and overall balance. The problem was that this ambition came with a price tag that broke expectations for the brand. In its launch year, the Trans Am cost around $4,500. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $37,000 to $40,000 today. By late 1960s standards, that was a high price for a compact Pontiac muscle car. For that kind of money, many buyers could step into larger cars, flashier engines, or models with a much more aggressive image. And even though the Trans Am didn't rely on visual excess, it wasn't weak under the hood. Depending on configuration, it offered V8 engines producing up to 335 horsepower. Very respectable numbers for the time. It wasn't designed to dominate the quarter mile, but to deliver a more balanced package with a better chassis, improved cornering, and a more serious driving feel. That technical focus was, paradoxically, part of the problem. In 1969, muscle car buyers still associated performance with noise, drama, and spectacle. The Trans Am demanded something different: understanding, and combined with its high price, that left it in an uncomfortable position in the market. The result was clear: sales were low, not because it was bad, but because it cost more than people were willing to pay for a Pontiac, and because it offered a level of sophistication many buyers weren't looking for at the time. Today, the story has completely flipped. In the current market, a well-preserved 1969 Firebird Trans Am typically sells for between $120,000 and $180,000, depending on originality and condition. A car that was born expensive and misunderstood ended up becoming a highly coveted collector's piece. 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429. When Ford launched the Boss 429, it wasn't thinking about the average buyer. This car wasn't created to sell well or even to be liked. It was built for a single purpose: to homologate a massive engine for NASCAR. And that decision shaped everything that followed. In its launch year, the Boss 429 carried a price tag between $4,800 and $5,000, an extremely high figure for a Mustang. Adjusted for inflation, that equals roughly $39,000 to $42,000 today. To put that into perspective, it costs nearly twice as much as a standard Mustang, and dangerously close to true luxury cars and refined performance machines. The biggest problem, and at the same time its most fascinating feature, was under the hood. The 429 Semi-Hemi Phi 8 was so large that it simply didn't fit in a Mustang. Ford had to modify the body, widen the engine bay, and outsource assembly to Carcraft, where the cars were essentially hand-built. No production efficiency, no commercial logic, just engineering pushed to the extreme. Officially, Ford rated the engine at around 375 horsepower, but in reality, it was clearly underrated. It was designed for high RPMs and oval track racing, not everyday street driving. The result was a strange Mustang, front-heavy, awkward in daily use, and far from refined. Fast, yes, but uncomfortable and impractical for normal driving. And here's where the core conflict appears. Buyers saw a Mustang, but the price said something else. The driving experience said something else. The true purpose said something else entirely. The Boss 429 was too expensive, too specialized, and too strange for the average buyer. It's no surprise it sold in very low numbers. At the time, it was seen as an expensive mistake, hard to justify and easy to ignore. Today, that story has been completely rewritten. In the current market, a well-preserved 1969 Mustang Boss 429 can command anywhere from $350,000 to well over $500,000, depending on condition and documentation. A car that was born expensive, uncomfortable, and misunderstood has become one of the most valuable Mustangs ever built. And the next car on this list takes this idea even further, because now we're not just talking about a high price, but a design so extreme that it actively scared buyers away. 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona. This is one of those cars that doesn't need visual context. One glance at the silhouette is enough to understand that something here went completely off the rails. The massive aerodynamic nose, the enormous rear wing, and proportions that looked more at home on a NASCAR oval than on a suburban street. And that was exactly the problem. In 1969, the Daytona carried a price tag close to $4,800, which today would equal roughly $40,000 adjusted for inflation. For a Dodge, and for a car with such an extreme appearance, that was a hard number to justify. For the same money, buyers could choose muscle cars that were more normal, more comfortable, and above all, far less attention-grabbing. Under the hood, the Daytona made no compromises. In Hemi form, it could be equipped with V8 engines producing over 425 horsepower. Numbers that were absolutely serious, even among the best muscle cars of the era. In a straight line, it was brutal, and at high speed, it was simply dominant. In fact, it became the first production car to exceed 200 miles per hour, a figure that no average buyer truly needed, or could realistically use. That's where the Daytona's central contradiction was born. It was expensive, it was extreme, and it was designed for a kind of driving that didn't exist in the real life of the average buyer. The public didn't know what to do with it. Many dealerships sat on unsold units for months, and some Daytonas were eventually discounted or even converted back into more conventional models just to move inventory. Not because they were slow or bad, but because they were simply too much car for the street and too expensive to take a risk on. Today, the irony is total. In the current market, an authentic Charger Daytona can be worth anywhere from $400,000 to well over $700,000, depending on configuration and originality. A car that nobody wanted to pay for at the time became one of the most valuable muscle cars ever produced. And now, I want your opinion, because this is a key point of the video. If you were standing in a Dodge dealership in 1969, would you have paid that price for a car as radical as the Daytona, knowing it wasn't practical or discreet? Or would you have chosen something more normal for the same money? Leave your answer in the comments. 1969 Pontiac GTO Judge RA4. The Judge was born as an emotional response. Pontiac wanted to reclaim attention, noise, and spotlight in a market saturated with extreme muscle cars, bright colors, aggressive graphics, and a much more youthful image. But once you step into RA4 territory, the story changes completely. In 1969, a GTO Judge equipped with the RA4 package easily surpassed $4,200, which today translates to roughly $34,000 to $36,000 adjusted for inflation. For a car that was supposed to be Pontiac's accessible muscle car, that price was already crossing an uncomfortable line. And here's the key point. The RA4 wasn't a cosmetic upgrade. It was a purely mechanical, extremely serious package. Under the hood lived a 400 cubic inch V8 officially rated at 370 horsepower, though in reality, it made significantly more. The problem was that this kind of engine wasn't friendly. It demanded skill to drive, knowledge to maintain, and patience to live with. It didn't offer effortless low-end torque or daily comfort. And that led many buyers to ask a very simple question. Why pay so much for a GTO that was no longer easy to live with? On top of that, the RA4 was extremely limited. Very few units were built, not because Pontiac planned exclusivity, but because almost nobody ordered it. Buyers wanted the GTO name, the Judge image, but not the price or the mechanical demands of the RA4. At the time, it was seen as an exaggerated, expensive, and illogical version. Today, that same approach has turned it into an absolute jewel. In the current market, an authentic GTO Judge RA4 can easily exceed $300,000 to $450,000, depending on condition and documentation. It's one of those cases where the car didn't fail for lack of character, but because it reached a point where even a legend like the GTO stopped being accessible to its own audience. 1969 Mercury Cyclone spoiler. The Cyclone is one of those cars that feels like it was built for the wrong place. It wasn't discreet, it wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't easy for the average buyer to understand. Mercury took the Cyclone and turned it into a machine built almost exclusively for NASCAR homologation, without worrying too much about whether that made sense on the street. In 1969, its price hovered around $4,800, which today would be roughly $40,000 adjusted for inflation. For a Mercury, a brand that was never synonymous with popular muscle cars, that was a tough sell. It cost as much as some of the most extreme muscle cars on the market, but without the fame or charisma of its direct rivals. Under the hood, the Cyclone spoiler could be equipped with big block V8s, including the 4.28 Cobra jet, with real-world output well above 400 horsepower. It was genuinely fast, especially at high speed, where its specific aerodynamic tweaks made a real difference. It wasn't built for stoplight drag races, but to stay stable and fast for long stretches, something very uncommon for a street muscle car. And here's where its biggest problem shows up. The design was strange, the focus was overly technical, and the message to the public was confusing. The typical buyer didn't understand why they should pay so much for a car that felt uncomfortable, highly specialized, and visually odd. The result was predictable. Very low sales and a reputation as a car built for the wrong audience. It wasn't bad. It was simply too specialized. Today, that same story works in its favor. In the current market, an authentic Mercury Cyclone spoiler can reach values between $250,000 and $400,000, depending on configuration and documentation. A car once ignored for being expensive and strange has become an extremely desirable rarity. And what comes next shifts the tone once again, because the next car shows how a Mustang stopped being a people's car and turned into a luxury item. 1967 Shelby GT500. This is one of those cars that today feels unquestionable, powerful, desirable, legendary. But in 1967, the story was very different. For many people, the GT500 wasn't a dream car. It was an excess that was hard to justify. At launch, the GT500 carried a price between $4,200 and $4,500, which today would equal roughly $35,000 to $38,000 adjusted for inflation. That placed it far above a regular Mustang and dangerously close to cars that were larger, more comfortable, and more luxurious. For the average buyer, the question was inevitable. Why pay so much for a Mustang? The answer was under the hood. The GT500 was powered by a 428 Police Interceptor V8 with real-world output close to or above 400 horsepower. It wasn't just raw power, it was torque, immediate thrust, and a sense of mechanical authority that very few muscle cars offered at the time. It was fast, intimidating, and demanding. But that performance came with a cost beyond money. The GT500 wasn't comfortable, it wasn't discreet, and it wasn't easy to live with on a daily basis. It was a car for someone who wanted something special, not for someone looking for a rational muscle car. And that's where the central conflict appears. The Mustang audience wasn't ready for a Mustang that expensive. Sales were limited, not because the car was bad, but because it had drifted too far from the original idea of an affordable Mustang. Shelby had turned a popular car into an aspirational object, and that left many buyers behind. Today, the market sees it very differently. A well-preserved 1967 Shelby GT500 typically sits between $250,000 and $400,000, depending on condition and authenticity. A car once seen as overpriced and excessive became an absolute symbol of American muscle. And now I want your opinion, because the dilemma here is very clear. If you were standing in a dealership in 1967, would you have paid that price for a Mustang like the GT500? Or would it have felt absurd to spend that much on a car that was born as a people's car? I'll read you in the comments. 1967. Chevrolet Corvette L88. The L88 wasn't expensive by accident. It was expensive on purpose. In 1967, Chevrolet offered the L88 package at a total price ranging between $6,500 and $7,000, depending on configuration. Adjusted for inflation, that equals more than $55,000 to $60,000 today, an absolutely disproportionate figure for an American car of the era. To put it in perspective, that money could buy a modest house in many states or several well-equipped family cars. What makes it even more interesting is that Chevrolet didn't actually want to sell it to the general public. The L88 was, essentially, a race Corvette disguised as a street car. It was powered by an aluminum 427 V8, extremely aggressive, officially rated at 430 horsepower, a number that was intentionally understated. In reality, the engine easily produced well over 500 horsepower, but Chevrolet didn't want inexperienced buyers anywhere near it. To reinforce that message, the car came loaded with inconveniences. No air conditioning, no radio, no refinement, extremely high compression, and demanding maintenance. It was loud, hot, difficult to drive in traffic, and absolutely brutal when pushed. Everything about the L88 screamed one thing: this is not for you. The high price, combined with that extreme experience, resulted in very low sales. Around 216 units total between 1967 and 1969. At the time, it was seen as an absurd oddity within Chevrolet's lineup. Today, that rarity is exactly what defines it. In the current market, an authentic Corvette L88 can easily exceed $2 to $3 million, placing it among the most valuable muscle cars ever produced. 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. This is one of the greatest commercial absurdities of the muscle car era. Not because it was slow, not because it was ugly, but because no one expected a Camaro to cost that much money. In its launch year, the ZL1 carried an approximate price of $7,200, an outrageous figure for 1969. Adjusted for inflation, that's well over $55,000 today. To put that into perspective, for the same money you could buy a well-equipped Cadillac, a modest house in some states, or several brand new family cars. And here lies the central conflict. It was a Camaro, a car born as an accessible alternative, not as an elite object. But Chevrolet broke every rule under the hood. The ZL1 was powered by an aluminum 427 V8, a pure racing engine derived directly from competition programs. Official figures were conservative, but in reality the engine produced well over 500 horsepower. It was brutal, demanding, and completely disproportionate for street use. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't docile. It made no sense as a daily driver. It was loud, hot, difficult to maintain, and built for people who truly knew what they were buying. Exactly the kind of car most Camaro buyers were not looking for. And that reality is reflected in one number that says everything. In 1969, Chevrolet built just 69 units of the Camaro ZL1. 69. Not because of planned exclusivity, but because almost no one was willing to pay that price for such an extreme Camaro. At the time, the ZL1 was seen as an expensive mistake, a commercially senseless extravagance, an incredible car, placed in the wrong segment. Today, that story has completely flipped. In the current market, an authentic Camaro ZL1 can easily exceed $1 million, precisely because of that combination of absurd price, extreme purpose, and ridiculously low production. 1965 to 1967, Shelby Cobra 427. If there's one car on this list that never even tried to be accessible, it's the Shelby Cobra. Unlike the others, it wasn't born as an exaggerated evolution of a popular model. It was created from the start as something extreme, uncompromising, and with absolutely no intention of appealing to the general public. At the time, a Cobra 427 cost around $7,500, which today would equal well over $60,000 when adjusted for inflation. And here's the detail that really puts everything into perspective. In many parts of the United States, that amount of money was enough to buy a brand new house. Literally, not a car, a house. Under the hood, there was no attempt at moderation. The big block 427 V8 delivered officially rated figures close to 425 horsepower, though in reality it was even more brutal. Combined with an extremely low curb weight, the Cobra had a power-to-weight ratio that made almost every other car of its era look slow and over-civilized. Acceleration was savage, raw, and unforgiving. No filters, no assists, and absolutely no room for mistakes. And that's the key point. The Cobra was not easy to drive. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't quiet. And it certainly wasn't safe by modern standards. It was violent, unpredictable, and brutally honest. A car that demanded respect and experience. It wasn't built for cruising or impressing the neighbors. It was built for people who wanted the closest possible thing to a race car with license plates. That explains why it was never a common car, not even among expensive muscle cars. In total, around 348 units of the Cobra, 427 were produced, including both street and competition versions. Not because of marketing strategy, but because very few people could afford it, and even fewer were capable of driving it properly. In its own time, the Cobra was seen as an elitist madness. Too expensive, too dangerous, and far too specialized. Today, that exact combination has turned it into an absolute myth. In the current market, an authentic Shelby Cobra 427 can easily exceed $2 to $3 million, depending on history and originality. It is the perfect example of what this video is about. An incredible car, an extreme car, a legendary car, but also a car that, when it was new, simply cost too much for almost everyone. These cars didn't fail because they lacked power. They didn't fail because they lacked character. Failure isn't even the right word. They simply went too far for their own time. And now, I want to hear from you. If you were living in the 1960s, which of these muscle cars would you actually have paid for? And which one would have felt like an impossible excess to justify? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the less obvious side of American automotive history, I recommend watching the last video we published on the channel. In it, we dive into the rarest classic pickups of the 1950s and 1960s. Strange, misunderstood vehicles that are incredibly valuable today. Click the video on screen and continue this journey with us through the stories almost nobody tells about the American automobile. See you in the next ride.